When we think of medieval castles, the mind often wanders to romanticized visions, soaring banners, the echo of rhythmic footsteps on polished stone, and the grand festive banquets that seem to stretch into the night. We picture the nobility as figures of absolute comfort, draped in velvet, sheltered behind impenetrable walls. But if we were to peel back the layers of these stone monoliths, if we were to step across the threshold on a biting mid-January night in the 13th century, that romantic image would shatter instantly. The first thing that hits you is not the majesty of the architecture, but the smell of cold stone. It is a pervasive, damp chill that seems to seep through your very bones. You see, the medieval castle was never designed for comfort in the way we understand it today. It was, first and foremost, a machine for defense. The thick walls, while formidable against siege engines, were essentially giant heat sinks. They absorbed the moisture of the earth and the frigid air of the winters, becoming cold radiators that kept the internal environment perpetually hovering just above the freezing point. Life in the castle was a constant negotiation with the elements. Sunlight, a fleeting visitor, struggled to penetrate the narrow arrow slits designed to keep intruders out. The air was thick, heavy, and motionless. For those living within these walls, from the high-ranking lords and ladies to the humblest scullery workers, the winter was not merely a season, it was an adversary. It dictated every movement, every social interaction, and every aspect of domestic life. We often imagine the castle as a place of static grandeur, but it was, in truth, a site of constant movement and adaptation. People were always shifting, always seeking the warmth of the hearth, always finding ways to conserve the precious, fleeting heat. It was a lifestyle defined by proximity, by the strategic use of layers, and by a profound understanding of how to endure. In this world, the simple act of sleeping was a complex logistics operation, a night quest for survival in a space that was inherently inhospitable. As we begin this journey into the quiet, frozen horrors of the past, we are not just observing history. We are looking at the resilience of the human spirit when faced with the absolute indifference of nature. We will dismantle the myths layer by layer to uncover how humanity lived, thrived, and found warmth in the heart of the stone. The channel's Sleepy History with Benedict is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of positive emotional values. If the castle was a living organism, the great hearth in the centre of the hall was undeniably its heart. In the vast cavernous spaces of the great hall, where the ceiling vanished in shadows high above, the fireplace was more than a utility. It was the focal point of all existence. To understand the medieval struggle against the cold, one must understand the relationship between the people and the flame. These were not the cosy, decorative fireplaces of a modern home. They were monumental structures, often built directly in the centre of the floor in the earliest designs, with a simple hole in the roof above to allow the smoke to escape. This is a crucial detail often overlooked. The smoke hole was a double-edged sword. While it allowed some ventilation, it also meant that a significant portion of the heat you worked so hard to generate was drifting straight up and out of the building. It was a constant battle between ventilation and warmth. Imagine the scene at dusk, the lords and the retainers, the dogs at their feet, the scullery staff finishing their final chores, all would gravitate toward this singular source of heat. The light from the fire would dance across the tapestries and the rough plastered walls, creating long shifting shadows that gave the hall a sense of mystery. The heat was intense right at the source, but it thinned out rapidly as you moved towards the perimeter of the room. This created a social hierarchy of proximity. The closer you were to the fire, the higher your status, or the more critical your role in the immediate circle of the Lord. The air in these halls was thick with the scent of burning logs, dried rushes, and the lingering odour of the day's meals. It was a sensory-heavy environment. You would hear the crackle of green wood, the rustle of straw on the floors, and the low, hushed tones of conversation. For the people of the time, the fire was a companion. It provided the only reprieve from the damp, biting chill that seeped through the stone foundation, yet the maintenance of this fire was a relentless task. Wood had to be gathered, dried and chopped, then transported in vast quantities. It was a constant, grueling logistical cycle that underpinned the entire economy of the castle. But as the embers began to glow deep red in the late hours, the reality of the cooling stone would begin to set in again. The fire couldn't burn forever, and as it dimmed, the cold would creep back into the corners of the hall. The transition from the warmth of the communal hearth to the individual quest for a night's sleep was perhaps the most challenging part of the day. It was a shift from the comfort of the group to vulnerability of the individual, setting the stage for the ingenious ways in which they would attempt to hold on to warmth throughout the night. While the central hearth provided the fire, the castle itself had to be taught how to hold that heat. It is a common conception that medieval walls were left bare and cold. In reality, the medieval mind was acutely aware of the necessity of thermal mass and insulation. Once you step beyond the defensive shell of the castle, you begin to see the intentional layers of comfort that separated the nobility from the harsh reality of the exterior climate. The most iconic of these, the tapestry, served a dual purpose that transcended mere aesthetics. Yes, they were status symbols woven with vibrant threads that depicted legends, hunts, and courtly love, but their primary function in the depth of winter was functional insulation. By hanging heavy woolen or embroidered linens against the freezing stone walls, the inhabitants created a buffer zone. These thick textile act as a barrier, preventing the body heat of those in the room from being sucked away by the thermal conductivity of the cold rock. They effectively dressed the stone, turning an icebox into living space. On the floor, the approach was equally pragmatic. The practice of using rushes, a mixture of dried reeds, grasses, and sometimes aromatic herbs, was far more than a way to cover a dirt floor. These thick layers of vegetation provide a necessary cushion between the feet and the cold, damp stone foundation. During the winter, these floors were often layered even thicker, creating a compressed, insulating mat that held the warmth near the ground. It was an organic, evolving carpet that was periodically cleaned and replenished, keeping the cold from rising directly in the living space. Architecturally, the evolution of the castle saw the rise of smaller, more private chambers called the sola. By moving out of the expansive, drafty Great Hall, and in these smaller partitioned spaces, people discovered a simple physical truth: smaller volumes are easier to heat. The sola was often tucked away, protected by the thicker sections of the castle walls and situated closer to the internal chimney systems that began to appear in later medieval centuries. Every nook, every curtain, and every piece of heavy furniture was positioned with the preservation of heat in mind. Furniture was designed to be portable and heavy, often kept away from outer walls to avoid the damp. We must visualize the castle not as a stagnant monument, but as a dynamic space that was constantly being reconfigured. Screens were placed to block drafts. Heavy drapes were drawn across doorways, and every architectural feature was leveraged to create a microclimate. It was a sophisticated, if rudimentary, system of climate control built on the ingenuity of necessity, where even the placement of a heavy wooden chest could determine the difference between a restless, shivering night and one of relative comfort. If the castle was a defensive structure for the body during the day, the bed was its equivalent for the night. To understand the medieval sleep, one must abandon the modern concept of a bed as a simple, solitary frame. The medieval bed was a sanctuary, an architectural marvel built to enclose the sleeper in a cocoon of warmth, effectively creating a room within a room. These structures were often towering, four-posted creation draped in heavy, thick fabrics. The curtains were not mere decorations. They were essential for sealing in the heat generated by the sleeper's body. By pulling these heavy drapes shut, one created a environment that remained significantly warmer than the frigid, open air of the surrounding chamber. Inside this enclosure, the mattress itself was a feat of material science for the era. It was typically stuffed with straw, dried grass, or for the more fluent soft goose feathers, which provided both comfort and a crucial barrier against the cold rising from the floor. The act of going to bed was a ritual. Because heat was so precious, the concept of the individual bedroom was a luxury reserved for the highest nobility, and even then it was not always solitary. For many, sleeping was a communal act. Servants, family members, and sometimes even travellers would share the warmth of a single, massive bed. This was not necessarily a sign of lack of privacy, but a survival strategy. In the deep winter, human body heat was the most efficient and readily available heating technology. To huddle together under thick wool blankets and heavy furs was simply the most logical way to ensure that everyone made it through the night without succumbing to the creeping frost. Consider the layering involved: linen sheets close to the skin, followed by heavy woolen blankets that provided insulation even when slight damp, and topped with thick furs, sheepskin, rabbit, or, for the elite, ermine. These furs were prized possessions, passed down through generations, and treated with the kind of care we might reserve for modern high-tech appliances. They were the front-line defense in the war against the winter night. As the candle flickered out and the hall fell into heavy frozen silence, the castle transformed. The sounds of the day, the clatter of metal, the shouting of commands, the bustling of staff, faded in the deep, rhythmic breathing of a house huddled for warmth. The bed stood as a testament to the medieval understanding of survival, an enclosed, insulated fortress that allowed life to pause and recharge, safe from the biting indifference of the winter outside. All stories on this channel, Sleepy History with Benedict, are fictional, thoughtfully crafted around historical themes inspired by real events, figures, and periods, reimagined for engaging storytelling. The content does not represent real individuals, actual events, or document cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is purely coincidental. The struggle against the cold was an equalizer in theory, but in practice, it was deeply stratified. Your social standing in the medieval hierarchy dictated not just how much power you held, but how much warmth you could command. As the sun set, the castle fractured into two distinct worlds, the world of the master and the world of the servant. For the nobility, the night was navigated through luxury. They commanded the solar or the private chamber, which could be fortified against the draughts with expensive tapestries, heavy velvet curtains, and the finest furs. Their beds were elevated, removing them from the coldest strata of the air near the floor, and their bedding was regularly fluffed and refreshed. They had the privilege of proximities to the internal chimneys, and the ability to dig when the fires were tended throughout the night. Their warmth was a protected commodity, managed by a retinue of attendants whose very job was to ensure the lord's comfort. Contrast this with the life of the average household servant or commoner. For them, sleep was a desperate communal affair, often relegated to the great hall or the draughty alcoves near the service areas. They did not have the luxury of thick, enclosed curtains or multiple layers of furs. Instead, they relied on the residual heat of the hall's dying embers, and, more importantly, the collective heat of their peers. Sleeping in the great hall meant lying on thin mattress of straw placed directly on the rushes, often heddled side by side in rows to maximize warmth. It was a life lived in the margins of the castle's infrastructure. There is a profound humility in this reality. While we look back at the grand architecture and see the power of kings and queens, the day-to-day survival of the castle depend on those who lived in the coldest, most exposed sections of the structure. They knew every draught, every cold stone, and every weakness in the castle's defences against the winter. Their ability to persevere was the engine that kept the entire social system running. It is a reminder that history is not just made of battles and crowns. It is forged in the silent, shivering nights of those who kept the hearths burning. If you find yourself captivated by these forgotten details of how humanity has weathered the storms of the past, please take a moment to hit the like button. It truly helps us bring these hidden stories to light. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and join our community as we continue to explore the intricate, untold rhythms of medieval life. We love reading your insights, so please share your thoughts and questions in the comment section below. What part of this history surprised you the most? When the sun dipped below the horizon and the internal temperatures of the castle plummeted, the inhabitants did not simply rely on the architecture to keep them warm. They relied on their own clothing as a primary portable shelter. In the medieval mind, clothes were not merely a display of fashion or status, though they were certainly that. They were a vital function layer of survival technology. The ability to endure the winter often came down to the sheer effectiveness of one's wardrobe. The foundation of this thermal protection was the layering system, a practice that remains the gold standard in outdoor survival even today. Closest to the skin, people wore linen. Linen was the ubiquitous base layer, prized for its durability and its ability to be washed repeatedly. While it is a breathable fabric, it provides a smooth, clean interface for the body. But the real magic began with the layers that followed. The medieval wardrobe was dominated by wool, a material that was and remains nothing short of miraculous. Even when slightly damp from the pervasive moisture of the stone halls, wool maintains its insulating properties, trapping pockets of warm air against the body. Over the tunic and undergarments, individuals would wear heavier wool outer layers. The structure of these garments was designed for function: long sleeves, high necklines, and tight cuffs to minimize the escape of body heat. For those of higher status, these garments were lined with fur. Furs were not just a luxury, they were the apex of winter insulation. A coat lined with rabbit, sheep, or fox fur was a significant investment, a piece of equipment that turned a freezing room into a manageable environment. It was common to see people wearing multiple tunics, one over the other, creating a dense, padded life that was perfectly adapted for life in an unheated stone labyrinth. And we must not forget the accessories. The head and the extremities are the quickest avenues for heat loss. Hoods, coifs, and thick woolen stockings were essential. Even inside the castle, the nobility would often wear heavy cloaks or mantles while moving between rooms. The transition between the heated chambers and the cold, vaulted corridors was a constant oscillation of temperature, and the wardrobe had to be flexible enough to handle this. It was a lifestyle where you were effectively dressed for the environment at all times, even while indoors. This reliance on textile meant that a castle was just a house, but also a clothing storehouse. The management of wool and furs was a year-round occupation. These items had to be cleaned, aired, mended, and protected from moths and dampness. If you were a person of means, you possessed a wardrobe that was essentially a collection of portable heating units, ready to be deployed at a moment's notice. It was a sophisticated, intimate relationship with materials that allowed the medieval inhabitant to walk through. A blizzard of stone and cold, largely unaffected by the frost that tried every night to claim the halls. The existence of a roaring fire in the great hall was not an act of magic. It was the result of a grueling, continuous, and highly organized logistical operation. To keep a castle warm through a long, harsh winter, the consumption of wood was staggering. We are not talking about a few logs here and there. We are talking about hundreds of tons of timber, sourced from the surrounding forests, seasoned, chopped, and transported across muddy, frozen tracks to the castle gates. This task fell upon the shoulders of the lower-ranking staff and the local peasantry who owed labour services to the lord. Throughout the autumn months, the rhythm of life in the castle was dictated by this harvest. Every spare hand was directed toward the woodpile. The timber had to be cut and stacked so that it would be dry enough to burn by the time the first frosts arrived. Green wood, which is full of moisture, would only hiss smoke and provide a fraction of the necessary heat, filling the rooms with suffocating vapour rather than warmth. Once inside the walls, the management of the fire was a specialised skill. There were fire tenders whose duty was to ensure that the hearth was never truly extinguished. In the dead of night, the embers were raked over and covered with ashes, a process known as curfew, derived from the French couvre feu, or cover the fire. This banked the heat, allowing the fire to smoulder until the morning, when it could be quickly revived. It was an essential safety measure as well. A loose spark in a hall filled with dry rushes and wooden furniture could turn a fortress into a furnace in a matter of minutes. The risk of fire was the constant, silent anxiety of the medieval household. Castles, for all their stone exterior, were filled with highly flammable material, tapestries, wooden rafters, straw floors, and the heavy bedding we discussed earlier. The fire tenders had to be vigilant, balancing the absolute necessity of warmth against the potential for catastrophe. They acted as the castle's environmental engineers, understanding the airflow within the hall, knowing exactly which logs burned longest, and how to position the fuel to maximize radiation without risking the structural integrity of the room. When we consider the sheer physical effort required to maintain this system, we begin to appreciate the weight of the winter. Every moment of warmth enjoyed by the inhabitants, every second spent basking near the hearth, had a direct cost in human labour. It was a cycle of constant exertion. The warmth in a medieval castle was literally paid for by the sweat of the people who gathered the fuel, tended the flames, and guarded the fire, ensuring that the cold remained a visitor at the gates rather than a master of the house. While the hearth provided the external warmth, the medieval inhabitant had a second, biologic strategy to fight the freezing air, the internal furnace of their own metabolism. In a world where the ambient temperature could drop near freezing, food was not just a matter of sustenance or pleasure, it was a critical survival tool. The medieval diet during the winter months was a deliberate high-energy fare designed to keep the human engine running under stress. This was the season of thick pottages, heavy stews, and roasted meats. These dishes were packed with fats and proteins, which provided the long-burning fuel needed for the body to generate heat throughout the long, dark nights. Ale and cider, often consumed in significant quantities, played a role far beyond mere refreshment. These beverages were calorie-dense and often served warm, infused with spices like ginger, cinnamon, and nutmeg. These weren't just flavourings. In the medieval understanding of the world, these hot spices were believed to stimulate the body, improve circulation, and help the constitution resist the damp chill of the environment. Consider the atmosphere of the evening meal. As the temperature fell outside, the food served was intentionally designed to be hot and comforting. Bread was baked daily, and the process of brewing ale and preparing these heavy, steaming meals was constant. It was a shared experience. Drinking a bowl of warmed, spiced ale while huddled near the hearth wasn't just a social ritual. It was a method of priming the body to endure the transition in the cold, sleeping quarters. The caloric intake required to maintain body temperature in an unheated room is significantly higher than that required in our modern, climate-controlled lives, and the medieval household was perfectly attuned to this biological reality. It is fascinating to see how the culinary habits were so intrinsically linked to the architecture of the building. The kitchen, often a separate structure or the most isolated part of the castle, was the centre of this energetic supply chain. From the butchery and the granaries to the final steaming bowls served in the great hall, the entire process was about converting the land's bounty into thermal energy required to keep people alive and functioning during the worst months of the year. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the practical, hidden realities of medieval life, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel. Your support allows us to continue reconstructing these intricate narratives of history. We are building a library of stories here, and your participation in the comments is what makes this community thrive. Have you ever wondered about other aspects of daily life in the past? Let us know your questions below, and we might just explore them in a future documentary. Even with a roaring fire and a wardrobe full of wool, the medieval inhabitant faced a persistent, invisible enemy. The draught stone castles, by their nature, were porous. The mortar between the stones, the gaps around the massive timber doors, and the narrow arrow slits designed for visibility, all became conduits for the frigid winter wind. To live in a castle was to be in a constant, silent battle against the movement of air. The architecture of a castle did not just contain heat. It actively tried to siphon it away through convection. Cold air, being denser than warm air, would pool at the bottom of the rooms, while the precious warm air would rise to the vaulted ceilings, far above the reach of the people. This phenomenon meant that you could be sitting inches from a fire and still feel a glacial breeze against your ankles. It was a sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics, long before the science was codified, that guide the daily maintenance of the living space. To combat this, the inhabitants used a variety of ingenious low-tech solutions. Thick, heavy curtains known as draperies were hung not just over windows, but over doorways and even around the beds. These curtains were often double-layered or lined with linen to create a dead air space, which is an excellent natural insulator. By creating these internal airlocks, the residents could effectively partition off sections of the room, keeping a pocket of warmer air confined to the area they were actually occupying. Another common technique was the use of wooden screens. A screen's passage at the lower end of the Great Hall was not merely for privacy. It was a physical barrier. designed to block the direct gusts of wind that would blow through the main entrance whenever a door was opened. It acted as a buffer, allowing the air to settle and preventing the sudden dramatic temperature drops that would otherwise extinguish the comfort of the inner hall. People were also adept at sealing the environment. They used beeswax, tar, and packed rags to fill the gaps in window frames and door casings. During the depths of winter, it was not uncommon to see rooms partially boarded up or draped in heavy fabrics to minimize the surface area exposed to the outside. It was a lifestyle of constant adjustment, a process of tuning the building to match the intensity of the season. To survive, you had to become an expert in the physics of your own home, sensing the slight shift in the air and reacting before the cold could claim the space. It was a testament to human adaptability, where the most basic tools were leveraged to create a semblance of comfort in a world defined by the unrelenting chill of the stone. Beyond the physical mechanics of insulation and the logistics of fuel, the most potent weapon against the medieval winter was, perhaps surprisingly, the social fabric self. The sheer necessity of huddling together in the great hall by the hearth or in the shared sleeping quarters fostered a form of common intimacy that is largely alien to our modern fragmented lives. The winter didn't just force people to be close, it reinforced the interdependence of the medieval household. In the long dark hours of winter, the hierarchy that defined the daylight hours often softened. When the master and the servant, the lady and the maid, all gather round the same fire to conserve heat, the distance between them, while still present, was bridged by the shared vulnerability of the cold. The storytelling, the mending of clothes, and the preparation of food became collective activities. These were not just chores, they were rituals of endurance. By sharing stories and warmth, the inhabitants maintained their mental resilience, preventing the isolation and despair that the harsh, frozen landscape outside could so easily induce. This communal living served a psychological purpose. To be alone in a cold, dark castle was to be in danger. To be part of the collective was to be secure. The home was not defined by a private room, but by the circle of the hearth. This environment demanded a high level of social cohesion. You had to be mindful of your peers, contributing your share of labour and resource to the group's survival. It created a sense of belonging that was tied directly to the rhythms of the house and the seasons of the year. Even the architecture played into this social dynamic. The Great Hall was designed to hold everyone, and its acoustic property, the way whisper carried, the way the fire crackled, meant that you were never truly isolated. You were always aware of the life around you. It was existence that prioritized the group over the individual, a reality that permeated every aspect of the culture. As we look back, we realize that the coziness we associate with history was not just a romantic idea, it was a survival mechanism born of necessity. If you are finding these historical explorations meaningful and want to help us keep this dialogue alive, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. We are deeply grateful for the community we are building together, where we can pause and reflect on the past in such a busy modern world. Your likes and your thought comments are the spark that fuels our work. What aspect of this shared history resonates most with you? Please join the conversation below and share your thoughts with us. While the rest of the household retreated in the heavy insulated sanctuary of their beds, the castle never truly went to sleep. The rhythm of the fortress was hyped, steady, maintained by those assigned to the night watch and the essential staff who worked in the shadows. For these individuals, the winter night was not a time for rest, but a time of heightened vigilance and persistent, grinding labour. They were the silent guardians of the flame, the ones responsible for ensuring that the cold did not overwhelm the structure during the hours of darkness. Consider the life of a castle guard or a chamber attendant whose duty spanned the deepest hours of the night. Their stations were often the most exposed parts of the fortress, the high walls, the gatehouse, or the draughty corridors that served as the primary arteries of the building. Armed with nothing more than a lantern and a thick wool cloak, they patrolled the perimeter. The cold at 3 a.m. in a stone tower was visceral. It felt like a physical weight, a constant pressure pushing against their resolve. They had to remain alert, maintain the integrity of the defences, while simultaneously managing the fires that kept the building's microclimate stable. These night workers were the unsung heroes of the medieval winter. They were the ones who checked the curfew fires, ensuring they remained banked and safe. They were the ones who replenished the fuel in the service areas and checked for drafts or structural weaknesses that the wind might have exploited during a storm. Their work was repetitive, lonely, and physically demanding. They navigated the castle in near, total darkness, knowing the floor plan so intimately that they could traverse the treacherous, spiral staircases by touch alone. There was a peculiar camaraderie among those who worked the night shifts. They shared a different world from those who slept, a world of whispered conversations, the clinking of keys, and the shared knowledge of the castle's secret, creaky soul. They understood the wind's patterns and the specific sounds of the building shifting as the temperature dropped. Their endurance was the foundation upon which the comfort of the nobility rested. Without these dedicated souls, the fire would have died, the draught would have taken hold, and the fragile hard-won warmth of the home would have dissipated into the night. As we peer into their world, we see a side of history that is rarely chronicled in textbooks, the reality of a 24-hour service economy that operated in the shadows. It was a cycle of constant maintenance, a devotion to the collective well-being that transcended individual comfort. They were the anchors of the household, the ones who ensured that when the sun rose, the castle was still warm, still standing, and still home. Their story is a reminder that the stability of any era is built upon the tireless efforts of those who work while the rest of the world rests. This content is inspired by and adapted from public domain works available through Project Gutenberg. The material has been transformed through original narration, editing, and storytelling to create a unique experience for educational and entertainment purposes. As the weeks of the deep freeze slowly ticked by, a subtle shift would begin to manifest within the walls of the castle. It was not a sudden change, but a slow, creeping realization that the worst of the winter's grip was beginning to loosen. You could see it in the way the morning light touched the stone floor, lingering just a few moments longer, casting a different, warmer hue against the tapestries. The cycle of the season was a fundamental truth of the medieval experience. The winter was a period of endurance, a long held breath, and its conclusion was a collective exhalation. The first signs of spring were often felt long before they were seen. The air within the halls would lose some of its sharp metallic bite. The firewood consumption would marginally decrease, allowing the fire tenders a small, precious reprieve. In the kitchens, the focus shifted from preserving what was left of the autumn harvest to the anticipation of the first fresh greens and the return of livestock to the pastures. The mood of the household, which had been tempered by the harsh inward look nature of the dark months, began to open up. The heavy doors, which had been kept tight shut against the wind, were occasionally left ajar, allowing fresh, albeit still cool, air to circulate through the stagnant chambers. This transition was a time of immense relief. The constant, nagging anxiety of the survival mode began to dissipate. The tasks that were once centered on preventing the loss of heat were replaced by the labor of renewal, cleaning the accumulated soot from the walls, airing out the heavy woolen bedding that had served as a fortress during the cold, and repairing the structural damage that the frost wrought on the stone foundations. It was an annual rebirth of the living space. Reflecting on this transition, one cannot help but admire the resilience of the people who occupied these stone halls. They lived in an intimate dance with the seasons, entirely pendant on the rhythms of the natural world. They did not conquer the winter, they learned to live with its parameters, adjusting their architecture, their social habits, and their very biology to survive it. As the ice retreated and the first buds appeared on the trees visible through the high window slits, the castle transformed once more. It shed its role as a survival machine and began to function again as a centre of commerce, governance, and community. This cyclical nature of life, the alternating between the inward protective stillness of winter and the outward expansive energy of spring, was the height of medieval civilization. It taught them to value the warmth of a fire and the closeness of a friend in ways we, in our climate-controlled world, have largely forgotten. The memory of the cold never fully left them, however. It remained in the dampness of the stone and the thickness of their walls, a reminder of the fragility of comfort and the strength required to endure when the world turns cold and dark. When we handle the artifacts of the Middle Ages, the heavy iron fire dogs, the worn-down wooden benches, the remnants of coarse hand-hoven lines, we are holding more than just historical curiosities. We are holding the material evidence of a struggle for warmth and comfort. Each scratch on a table, each frayed edge of a tapestry, tells a story of a long winter night where life was lived in the pursuit of survival. These objects were not static. They were the essential companions of those who endured the cold, absorbing the heat of the hearth and the wear of daily existence. The craftsmanship of these items is often deceptively simple, yet it reflects an acute understanding of the environment. Consider the heavy dark oak furniture designed to withstand the humidity of the castle walls, or the metal utensils forged to handle the direct heat of the open fire. There was an elegance in this functionality. The people of the time did not distinguish between beauty and utility in the way we often do. A well-made, heavy wool blanket was beautiful because it provided warmth. A sturdy fireplace tool was beautiful because it performed its duty reliably. As we look at these remnants in museum collections or reconstruct them in our minds, we begin to bridge the temporal gap between our lives and theirs. We recognize the same basic human needs, the desire for comfort, the need for community, and the fundamental instinct to seek shelter from the harshness of the elements. These objects have survived because they were built to last, a testament to the frugality and the necessity of a time when resources were scarce and winters were unforgiving. There is a profound sense of continuity in this. We still seek the same comfort today, even if our methods have become more technological and less manual. When we sit by a fireplace or pull a blanket tight on a cold night, we are unknowingly participated in an ancient human ritual. We are echoing the actions of those who lived centuries before us, who sat in the same shadow of a castle wall, waiting for the spring. This is the materiality of history, the way in which the past remains present through the things that people touched, used, and rely upon to make their lives bearable. It is a reminder that while the world around us changes, the human condition, our vulnerability to the cold and our capacity to find warmth remains fundamentally the same. When you look closely at those worn-down wooden benches or the smoothed edges of a heavy iron pot, those artifacts we touch upon, you realize they were never meant to be museum pieces. They were the silent partners in a lifetime of daily, predictable routines. Every scratch on that bench marks a moment where someone sat to mend a piece of wool, or perhaps to share a quiet, whispered conversation at the end of a long day. These objects were not just kept, they were experienced day after day until they became part of the castle's own skin. This continuity of use is what gave the castle its soul. Think of the blanket you pulled tight against your shoulders last night, or the way you tended the hearth fire with a practiced, almost unconscious rhythm. The people of the Middle Ages did the centuries before us. They lived in a loop of essential, gentle rituals, the sweeping of the rushes to keep the floor clean, the folding of the furs to store their warmth for the next night, and the daily polishing of a bowl so that it was ready for the next meal. There was a profound comfort in this predictability. In a world where the winter wind could be harsh and unpredictable, the internal rhythm of the home, the simple repetitive nature of these chores, provided a necessary anchor. It meant that even when the weather outside was at its worst, the interior life of the castle remained steady and cared for. You knew exactly where the warm spot by the hearth would be. You knew the exact fold of your heavy wool cloak that would best trap your body heat, and you knew the comfort of your companions as they went about their own task in the low golden light. When we consider these objects now, we shouldn't just see the metal or the wood, we should see the hands that used them. We should see the person who, every single evening, carefully banked the fire so the room would be warm when they woke. That act of care wasn't just a chore, it was a way of holding on to life, of saying that despite the cold, we are here, we are together, and we are creating a home. The legacy of the castle isn't found in the height of its towers, but in the quiet, lingering warmth that these daily rituals left behind in the very stone itself. As the evening light begins to fade and the heavy shutters are pulled tight, the castle enters a different phase of existence. The earlier bustle of the day, the labour of the kitchen, the mending of the hearth, the rhythmic movement of chores, settles into a quieter, more intimate form of connection. In this low golden light, you see the true nature of communal life. People don't always need to speak to understand the shared goal of the household. A nod, a small adjustment of a stool closer to the fire for a weary companion, or the silent act of passing a warm, spiced drink down the line, these are the unspoken languages of connection. There is something deeply grounding about sitting in a circle, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows against the tapestries. You notice how the hierarchy of the day seems to soften in the heat of the hearth. Whether you are the lord of the hall, or the person responsible for the morning chores, everyone is simply a human being seeking shelter from the encroaching night. The cold is a great equalizer, and the warmth is a shared gift. It is in these moments of stillness, where the only sounds are the crackling of wood and the low hum of distant wind outside, that you realize how much of their life was built on this mutual reliance. You might watch someone carefully tucking a thick, worn-out cloak around a child, or see the elders sharing stories in voices that barely rise above the fire's crackle. There is no urgency here, no modern rush to be anywhere else. There is only the here and the now, the shared experience of surviving another day. This was a life of profound presence. by focusing on the small, tangible tasks, keeping the fire live, mending the threadbare seams of a wool tunic, ensuring there is enough bread for the morning. They cultivated a sense of security that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with care. This is the hidden wisdom of the medieval domestic life, that home is not a place you simply inhabit, but a space you actively create through these small, repetitive acts of kindness and duty. As the embers of the fire begin to settle into a soft glowing red, there is a shared understanding that tomorrow will bring its own challenges, but for now everyone is safe, everyone is warm, and everyone is together. It is a quiet, powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that the strong walls aren't made of stone, but of the connections we forge in the warmth of our shared home. As the hour grows late, the great hall begins to empty, the sounds of the day slowly replaced by the heavy, settling silence of the stone structure. One by one, the embers in the hearth are raked over, the couve-feu, or cover fire, applied to ensure the flames remain banked and safe throughout the dark hours. It is a moment of transition that feels almost sacred. The transition from the shared warmth of the collective space to the private sanctuary of the bed is done with a quiet, deliberate care. Imagine walking back through the dimly lit corridors, the cold stone floor hidden beneath the thick, comforting layers of rushes. Your lantern cast long, flickering patterns on the tapestries, the images of hunts and legends seeming to shift and sway in the darkness. You reach your chamber, or perhaps your corner of the shared sleeping space, and pull the heavy curtain closed. In that instant, the world outside ceases to exist. The wind that batters the castle walls becomes a muffled, distant memory, and you are left in a environment of your own making. This is the peak of the medieval domestic ritual. Inside the four-posted bed, shrouded in heavy wool and linens, the air is still and warm, held in by the weight of the fabric. You can hear the rhythmic deep breathing of the household as they drift off, a sound that is profoundly reassuring. There is no anxiety here, only the simple primal satisfaction of a body that has worked hard and is now at rest. You feel the softness of the mattress beneath you, the gentle weight of the furs, and the profound safety of being tucked away, shielded from the vast freezing night by thick stone and layers of thread. It is a state of being that we rarely achieve in our modern lives, a total unadulterated stillness. There is no blue light from screens, no distant hum of traffic, no interruptions. Just the darkness, the warmth, and the long, uninterrupted stretch of sleep that follows the labour of the day. In this quiet, you realize that the medieval night was not a time of fear, but a time of complete restorative peace. It was the final reward for the day's persistence, a gentle drift in the deep, dark comfort of a home that had been painstakingly built, maintained, and warmed by human hands. When you live a life governed by the rising and setting of the sun, and by the relentless turning of the seasons, you learn a different kind of patience. Time in the medieval castle did not move in digital ticks or synchronized minutes. It moved in the rhythm of tasks completed and needs met. There was a unique wisdom in this, a recognition that every moment of comfort was a transient thing, a gift secured only by the labour that preceded it. The warmth you felt at the end of the day was not a constant, guaranteed state. It was a success, a hard, one reprieve from the cold that waited just beyond the stone. This awareness coloured every interaction. When someone offered you a place close to the fire or a bowl of warm, spiced pottage, it was not just a gesture of kindness. It was an act of sharing a precious resource. You didn't take these small comforts for granted because you knew intimately the effort required to make them possible. You saw the cracked hands of the person who spent the afternoon in the biting wind. You saw the soot on their face, and you understood the hidden cost of the ease you were now enjoying. In our modern haste, we have largely forgotten this. We expect comfort to be an inherent right, a static baseline of our existence. But to look back at the medieval household is to remember that ease is a fragile architecture built on the steady, quiet work of people who cared for one another. There is a deep beauty in that interdependence. It teaches us to slow down, to look at the people around us, and to recognize the silent efforts that make our lives bearable. Perhaps it is the greatest legacy of those who lived within these walls. They left behind no great speeches or complex philosophies, but they left a pattern of living that honors the human struggle. They remind us that even when the world feels vast, cold, and indifferent, we have the capacity to create our own sanctuaries. We can still kindle a fire, we can still share a space, and we can still offer the gift of our presence to one another. And in doing so, we turn a collection of stone and shadow into a home. It is a simple, enduring truth that no matter how much the world changes, the act of keeping each other warm remains the most profound human thing we can do. In the heart of a medieval household, there was a quiet, almost sacred respect for the things that sustain life. Nothing was ever truly old in the way we perceive it today. Everything was simply in a different state of repair. The art of mending was not merely a chore reserved for the idle hours. It was a fundamental philosophy of existence. To mend a garment, to patch a pair of leather boots, or to bind the handle of a heavy iron tool was to actively participate in the survival of the home. Consider the winter evenings spent by the fire, where the household would gather not just for warmth, but for the work of restoration. You would see hands calloused and skilled, working by the flickering light, thread needles with thick, coarse wool to bridge the gaps in a tunic that had seen many winters. There was no shame in a patch, rather a well-mended cloak was a badge of stewardship. It represented a person who understood the value of their resource and the fragility of their comfort. When you take the time to fix what is broken, you are not just saving a piece of material, you are grounding yourself in the reality of your environment. This spirit of care extended to every corner of the castle. If a wooden stool wobbled, it was braced with a fresh strip of iron or a wedged piece of oak. If a ceramic vessel developed a hairline fracture, it was carefully bound with wire and resin, ready to serve for another season. This constant rhythmic maintenance prevented the slow decay that the dampness of stone walls so often invited. It created a living cycle where the house was constantly being renewed by the very people who lived within it. There was a profound sense of satisfaction in this work. To take something that was failing and make it whole again was a way of imposing order on a world that felt, at times, chaotic and freezing. It required patience, focus, and a steady hand qualities that were prized above almost all else. In these moments of repair, the noise of the outside world, the howling wind, the uncertainty of the harvest fell away. There was only the task at hand and the quiet, steady progress of stitching, binding, and securing. It is a reminder that resilience is not always about grand gestures or great strength. Often it is found in the simple, quiet determination to keep things together, one stitch at a time. While the winter landscape outside the castle walls remained locked in a deep icy sleep, the heart of the kitchen was a place of quiet, persistent life. This was where the promise of the coming spring was nurtured. Management of the stores, the dried beans, the salted meats, the sacks of grain, was a precise daily duty. It required a steady eye to balance what must be consumed today against what must be preserved to see the household through to the first harvest. There was a unique kind of hope in this inventory, a belief that the cycle would turn and the earth would provide again. In the dim corners of the larder, seeds for the coming spring were sorted and protected with the utmost care. These were not just remnants of the past year's harvest, they were the blueprints for the future. Handling them was a ritual of trust. Every jar of dried herbs, every bundle of onions hanging from the rafters, and every crock of preserved fruit told a story of careful planning against the lean, hungry months. The kitchen staff moved with a measured, economical grace, ensuring that no crumb was wasted and that every resource was utilized to its fullest potential. The act of cooking during these months was a form of alchemy. With a limited palette of ingredients, grains and preserved proteins, the goal was to create warmth and sustenance that felt like a comfort. It was the slow, bubbling pottage that offered the most solace. The steam rising from the heavy iron pot would fill the kitchen, carrying the earthy scents of thyme, onions, and slow-cooked meat. It was a humble, grounding aroma that did more than just fill an empty stomach. It signaled to everyone in the hall that they were being looked after. This careful stewardship was the hidden bedrock of the castle's survival. It taught a lesson of restraint, a recognition that living well was not about abundance, but about the intelligent, grateful use of what one had. As you watched the kitchen stewards work, you could see they were not just preparing a meal, they were participating in a long, unbroken chain of life. They were guarding the future, tending to the seeds and the stores, with the quiet confidence of those who know that even the longest winter must eventually yield to the sun. It was a testament to the fact that life in the castle was never static. It was always looking forward, always preparing, and always waiting for the first thaw. In the deep quiet of a winter's night, the castle developed its own unique language of sound. To a modern ear, the environment might seem unnervingly still, but for those who lived within these stone walls, the silence was never absolute. It was a tapestry woven from small rhythmic noises that signalled safety and order. These were the sounds of a life lived in close quarters, where every movement had a purpose and every noise had a meaning. As the evening deepened, the most prominent sound was the hearth itself. The fire didn't just crackle, it breathed. You would hear the soft, rhythmic popping of resin in the oak logs, a sound that acted like a heartbeat for the entire room. If you listened closely, you could hear the distant muffled howl of the wind as it navigated the outer curtain walls, a harsh, cold note that only served to make the interior warmth feel more profound by contrast. It was a reminder of the barrier that the stone provided, a separation between the chaotic elements and the sanctuary of the hall. Inside, the house had its own soft percussion. There was the occasional rhythmic scrape of a broom brushing away the day's soot, the heavy, muffled thud of a wooden door latching into place, and the soft, dry rustle of wool blankets being adjusted. When the household moved, they did so with a deliberate slowness. You could hear the faint, steady pad of feet across the stone smoothed over by the thick layer of rushes beneath. These sounds were predictable and constant, forming a lullaby of domesticity that anchored everyone to the space they shared. There was a profound peace to be found in this soundscape. It was the music of a life that was stripped of the frantic digital noise we are accustomed to today. There were no jarring interruptions, no high-frequency hums of machinery, only the raw, organic sounds of materials being used for their intended purpose. To sit in that dim light and listen to the house settle, the groaning of timber beams in the cold, the soft settling of ashes, the rhythmic breathing of those nearby, was to understand the true texture of home. It was a sense of confirmation that all was as it should be, a quiet acoustic promise that through the long dark hours the household remained intact, connected and warm. The morning ritual of dressing was far from the hurried, mindless act it often is today. In the cold, unyielding environment of a medieval stone chamber, your clothing was your first and most important line of defence against the elements. It was a deliberate, layered process, a slow construction of personal insulation that required patience and foresight. You did not simply put on clothes, you built a microclimate around your own skin. It began with the innermost layer, the shift or chemise of fine, soft linen. It was smooth against the skin, designed to be breathable yet close, fitting, acting as a second skin that could be laundered and cared for. Over this came the tunic, often of thicker, sturdier weave and perhaps a sleeveless surcoat for added protection. But the true work lay in the outer garments, the heavy wool cloaks and the furs that were draped and pinned with precision. Every brooch, every cord, and every toggle had a function. You learned to layer with an intuitive understanding of how air, trapped between the fibres, held the heat your body produced. There was a tactile intimacy to this process. You could feel the weight of the wool, the coarseness of the thread, and the warmth that began to build as each layer was added. It was a time for reflection, a moment of quiet focus before the day's duties began. You had to ensure every seam was tight, every fastening secure, because you knew that once you stepped out into the drafty corridors or the biting air of the courtyard, your comfort depended entirely on how well you had prepared yourself. A loose pin or a gap in your cloak wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an invitation for the cold to seep in. This dressing ritual was in its own way an act of self-respect. It was an acknowledgement that your body was a precious thing, worthy of care and protection. It demanded that you understand your relationship with the temperature of the world around you. As you fastened the last clasp and felt the familiar, protective weight of your heavy cloak settle on your shoulders, you felt a sense of readiness. You were not just protected against the winter, you were empowered by it. You had taken the raw materials of the loom and the hearth and turned them into a suit of armour for the everyday. A testament to the fact that with enough care and the right preparation, even the most formidable cold could be kept at bay. There is a subtle, almost imperceptible shift that happens when the absolute peak of winter begins to wane. It is not marked by a sudden change in temperature, but by a quality of light that feels slightly different, less brittle, more forgiving. Inside the castle, this change is felt as a softening of the daily struggle. The urgency to keep the hearth burning at a fever pitch relaxes just a fraction, and the rhythm of the household breathes a little easier. You see it in the way people pause for a second longer when they pass by the narrow window slits, their gaze lingering on the distant, thawing fields rather than immediately retreating back to the warmth of the interior. This is the season of anticipation. The chores remain, the cold is still a presence in the corners of the rooms, but there is a quiet, blossoming hope that things are shifting. You notice the kitchen staff spending more time sorting through the remaining stores, not with the anxiety of conservation, but with the practical calculation of how much can be shared or prepared as the first green shoots begin to emerge from the frozen mud outside. The conversation around the evening fire takes on a lighter tone. There are mentions of the coming spring, of the work that will soon take place in the gardens, and of the animals that will stir from their long dormancy. The stone walls, which once felt like a fortress against an enemy, begin to feel like a cocoon. The transition is slow, marked by tiny victories, the sound of water dripping steadily from the eaves, the arrival of a bird that perches on the high battlements, or the way the morning mist clings to the valley floor a little less stubbornly. These are the markers of a world beginning to wake up. For those who have spent the long dark months in the steady rhythmic life of the castle, these signs are profound. They are a promise kept, the confirmation that the harshness of the season was only a temporary state, and that the warmth they guarded so fiercely throughout the winter was, in fact, the seed of their own resilience. To witness this change from within is to understand that life is never meant to be a permanent state of survival. Even in the deepest cold, there was always a sense of movement, a forward look, patience. As you go about your daily rituals, mending, tending the fire, sharing a meal, you do so with a renewed sense of purpose. The preparation was not in vain. You have carried the hearth's warmth through the silence of the winter, and now, as the air begins to hum with the quiet promise of renewal, you find that the strength you cultivated in the cold is exactly what you need to welcome the new season. There is a distinct geometry to the solitude one finds within the castle walls. It is not a lonely or empty feeling. Rather, it is a structured, heavy silence that demands a different kind of attention. When the candles burn low and the bustle of the common hall fades, you are left with the sheer, unyielding presence of the stone. In this stillness, the boundaries between the self and the space begin to blur. You are no longer just an inhabitant. You are a part of the castle's own long-standing memory. In these moments, the mind tends to settle into a natural rhythm. Without the constant chatter of the outside world, your thoughts become as clear and deliberate as the rhythmic ticking of a drop of water somewhere in the dark. You might find yourself observing the way the moonlight traces the patterns of the masonry, or how the shadows from the hearth fire dance upon the rough, hewn timbers of the ceiling. It is a form of active meditation. The cold, which at midday was challenged to be mastered, at night becomes a companion that encourages you to retreat inward, to reflect on the nature of your own endurance. This solitude was a necessary tonic. The communal life of the castle, with its constant interdependencies and shared labours, was intense and demanding. To step away into the quiet of your own corner was to reclaim a piece of yourself. It was here, in the dim, cool air of the night, that one could truly process the weight of the day, the small, seemingly insignificant acts of kindness, the frustrations of the work, the quiet pride in a task well finished. These are the moments where the character is forged, not in the spotlight of the social hall, but in the private, unobserved spaces of the mind. This is the beauty of the medieval domestic experience. It acknowledged that while we are fundamentally connected, we are also ultimately alone with our thoughts. The castle provided the space for both. It was a structure built for community, yet it contained within its thickness the perfect setting for individual reflection. As you sit in the dark watching the last embers glow, you realize that this stillness is not a void, it is a foundation. It is the quiet, sturdy base upon which all the warmth, all the labour, and all the connections of the household are built. And in that realization, you find a deep, enduring peace, a sense of belonging that exists even when you are entirely by yourself. Living within the stone walls of the castle meant living in a tactile world, one where you were constantly reminded of the substance of existence. In our modern era, we are often surrounded by surfaces that are smooth, uniform, and disconnected from their origins. But in the medieval home, every object you touched had a history, a texture that told you exactly how it came to be. There was no mistaking the grain of a hand-hewn oak table which bore the subtle wavy ridges left by the draw knife, or the cool uneven surface of a slate floor that had been worn down by centuries of use. You learned to read these textures like a language. The handle of an iron tool, polished smooth by the oils of 1,000 palms, felt different than the rough, unrefined metal of a newly forged latch. The thick, scratchy wool of a winter cloak possessed a coarseness that promised warmth, while the fine, crisp linen of a nightshirt carried the calming breath of the flax field. Because you interacted with these items every single day, you developed a physical intimacy with your environment. You knew the weight of a water bucket when full, the specific resistance of a heavy door, and the way the stone walls radiated a subtle, damp coolness, even when the fire was roaring. This deep engagement with the material world had a grounding effect on the psyche. When you spend your day working with wood, stone, and wool, you are constantly reminded that you are a part of the natural order. You are not hovering above the world, interacting with it through screens and interfaces. You are immersed in it, manipulating the very stuff the earth is made of. There is an honesty in this that is incredibly soothing. If a bowl broke, you saw the clay. If a bench creaked, you felt the wood flex. There were no hidden mechanisms, no mysterious black boxes, only the straightforward, reliable behavior of natural things. This tactile connection fosters a sense of responsibility because you understood the material, you understood the care it required. You didn't treat a wooden chair as a disposable object because you knew the effort it took to fell the tree, split the timber, and shape the legs. This awareness slowed the pace of life. It made the simple act of sitting down, eating a meal, or pulling on a cloak a mindful experience. You were not just using things, you were in a constant, respectful dialogue with them. And in that dialogue, the castle became more than just a place to live. It became a partner in the ongoing work of survival, a physical extension of the hands that built and maintained it. There is no place where the quiet, unpretentious beauty of domestic life is more visible than around the simple trestle table at the end of the day. In the medieval household, a meal was rarely an individual affair, swallowed in a hurry while focusing on something else. It was a communal anchor, a dedicated pause in the day's labour where everyone gathered to share the same basic sustenance. The food itself was rustic and unadorned, thick, dark loaves of rye or barley, a slow, simmered pot of grain and vegetables, perhaps a small wedge of hard cheese, but the manner in which it was consumed carried a profound weight. The central ritual of this gathering was the breaking of the bread. The loaf was not merely sliced with mechanical indifference, it was held against the chest, scored with a knife, and broken or distributed by hand. To receive a piece of the loaf was to be recognized as a vital part of the home. There was a beautiful, silent equality in the way the food was passed along the bench. In the low light of the tallow candles, the grand architecture of the castle shrunk down to the width of the table, and the differences between those who worked the fields and those who managed the halls dissolved in the shared necessity of hunger and relief. As you dipped a crust of bread in the communal bowl of pottage, you listened to the quiet murmur of voices around you. The talk was rarely about grand events or distant politics. It was about the immediate, tangible reality of their world. It was a discussion on how the chimney was drawing, whether the store of firewood would last the week, or how the sheep were faring in the lower pens. This was the true history of the era, not the battles fought on open plains, but the small, persistent conversation that kept a household functioning through the winter. This simple act of dining together was a day renewal of their social contract. It was a sensory reminder that no one survived in the castle alone. The warmth of the soup, the chew of the coarse grain, and the close proximity of your companion created a powerful sense of sanctuary. Outside, the world might be cold, dark, and indifferent, but here, around the scarred wood of the table, there was food, there was light, and there was a shared kitment to see each other through to the next morning. It was the ultimate expression of the domestic spirit, a quiet daily proof that the simplest things are often the ones that bind us the tightest. In the architectural language of the medieval castle, the threshold was far more than a simple transition between the outer courtyard and the interior halls. It was the psychological boundary of the home, a physical manifestation of the line between the chaotic, unpredictable world and the sanctuary of the hearth. To cross this threshold was a meaningful act, a ritualistic shedding of the cold, the dirt, and the weariness that clung to you after a day spent labouring in the elements. Think of the heavy, iron oak doors that stood at these entrances. They were designed not just to keep intruders out, but to create a deliberate pause in your movement. When you stepped over the threshold, you were expected to leave the anxieties of the fields and the harshness of the wind on the other side. There was a profound sense of decompression that occurred in that short span of distance. As the door swung shut and the heavy latch dropped into place, the sound of the world outside, the howling of the storm, the creaking of trees, the vast empty silence of the night was instantly muffled, replaced by the warm, earthy stillness of the interior. This transition was essential for maintaining the emotional temperature of the household. By acknowledging the threshold, you were signalling to yourself and to those inside that you were entering a different space, one where the rules of the struggle gave way to the rules of care. It was a moment of grounding. You would stamp the snow from your boots, shake the frost from your wool cloak, and feel the immediate shift from the biting air of the courtyard to the thick, comforty atmosphere of the hall. This awareness of the threshold taught a lesson in boundaries that we often lose in our modern open-plan lives. It fostered an appreciation for the inside. It reminded you that safety was not a universal state, but a curated environment that had to be actively maintained. Every time you passed through those heavy frames, you were reaffirmed in your membership of the household. You were coming home, and in that coming home, you were contributing to the integrity of the space. The threshold was the castle's guardian, and silent invitation to drop your guard and find rest, affirming that no matter how difficult the outside world might be, you had a place that was yours to keep warm, protected, and together. Within the expansive, often daunting scale of the stone castle, the presence of domestic animals provided a vital bridge to the living world. They were not merely creatures of utility, the cat hunting mice in the dark grain stores, or the hounds resting by the hearth, but were active, breathing participants in the domestic rhythm. Their role went far beyond their function. They were the silent guardians of the household's emotional climate, infusing the rigid, cold architecture with a sense of vitality and unpredictability that humans alone could not provide. Consider the hounds, stretched out in the flickering light of the great hall. Their presence acted as a primal anchor. In a space defined by the harsh geometry of stone and mortar, their rhythmic, deep-chested breathing and the occasional thumping of a tail against the rushes served as a grounding cadence. They lived entirely in the present, unaffected by the anxieties of the harvest or the burdens of lordship. To watch them doze was to witness an absolute surrender to the moment, a state of relaxation that encouraged the humans around them to also release the tension of the day. They offered a tactile warmth that felt inherent protective, their presence turning a barren corner of the hall into a place of rest and belonging. Beyond the dogs, the humbler creatures served as keepers of the household's sanctity. The barn cat, often seen patrolling the perimeter or curled in the deep alcoves of the windows, brought a subtle intelligence to the environment. Their movements were deliberate, fluid, and silent, a sharp contrast to the slow, heavy motions of human labour. They observed the life of the castle with a detached focus, reminding those who lived there that nature was always present, even within the thickest fortifications. When a cat groomed itself in a patch of sunlight, or a dog stirred in its sleep, it brought a flicker of light-heartedness in the long, dark winter months. This interspecies companionship was fundamental to the endurance of the medieval household. It transformed the castle from a static structure into a living, breathing collective. The animals did not ask for long-term security or complex planning. They required only food, warmth, and a place to reside. In return, they gave a steady, uncomplicated devotion that asked for nothing more than one's presence. In the quiet hours when the work was done and the fire burned low, the gentle interaction with these animals provide a profound, wordless connection that reminded the inhabitants they were not alone. It was a symbiotic bond, a shared existence that anchored the heart within the stone, making the vast cold fortress feel, in the truest sense, like a home. In the medieval castle, light was not a constant, ambient background, it was an event. Because the walls were built primarily for defence, windows were necessarily small, narrow apertures designed to permit archers to aim outward while denying intruders entry. This architectural choice fundamentally dictated the quality of existence within. Instead of the washed-out, diffuse illumination of modern glass, walled building, the castle interior was defined by a dramatic, almost sculptural interplay of light and shadow. As the sun moved across the sky, these narrow shafts of light became celestial needles, piercing the darkness of the hall at precise angles. They moved with a slow, agonizing grace across the floor, illuminating patches of dust, the texture of a stone wall, or a single worn wooden bench. This movement served as an organic clock, a visual reminder that time was not a mechanical construct but a celestial passage. One could tell the time of day simply by where the light struck the masonry. This forced a heightened state of observation. You became attuned to the sun's cycle, feeling the shift from the sharp, cold light of morning to the long amber glow of the afternoon, and finally to the deep blue-grey dimness of dusk. The psychological impact of this lighting was profound. The deep recesses of the chambers, the areas where the light could not reach, offered a sanctuary of shadow. These dark corners were not seen as grim, but as necessary zones of rest. They provided a visual buffer that allowed the eyes to relax, trusting sharply with the brilliance of the sun-drenched patches. This constant shift between light and dark cultivated a rhythm of focus and release. In the light, tasks were performed sewing, cleaning, or inspecting goods, with intense concentration. In the shadow, the mind was granted permission to wander, to rest, and to retreat from the visual demands of the environment. Furthermore, this interplay of light emphasized the massive solidity of the architecture. The way the sun caught the edges of a stone doorway, or highlight the rough texture of a vaulted ceiling, emphasized the permanence of the castle. It made the walls feel like living monoliths, shielding those within from the vast, indifferent sky. This gave the inhabitant a specific sense of place, a feeling of being held within something ancient, strong, and enduring. In our modern age, where we fight to eliminate shadow, the medieval inhabitant learned to live in harmony with it. They understood that without the deep shadows, the brilliant shafts of light would lose their meaning. It was an aesthetic of honesty, where the building did not try to mask the passage of time or the harshness of the elements, but instead used light to frame them as part of a sacred daily ritual of endurance. In the long dark hours of a medieval winter, when the practical labour of the day was finally set aside, the castle underwent a subtle transformation. Without the distraction of written text or artificial spectacles, the great hall became a theatre of the spoken word. This was the true library of the age, not a collection of bound parchment, but a repository of memory, folklore, and moral instruction carried entirely within the minds of the people. Storytelling was the fundamental technology of human connection, a way to weave the disparate lives of the household into a single, shared tapestry of experience. The act of storytelling was rarely a performance for an audience. It was an intimate, reciprocal exchange. As the fire cast flickering, dancing shapes against the stone walls, the storyteller voice, measured, rhythmic, and familiar, became the primary anchor for everyone in the room. These tales were often repurposed histories, local legends, or fables of struggle and triumph that had been passed down through generations. They served a vital social function. They established a moral landscape. By listening to stories of heroes who endured great cold, or of wise stewards who saved their people through careful preparation, the listeners were being taught how to survive and how to be better members of their community. There was a profound discipline in this mode of communication. Because the stories existed only in memory, they were constantly refined and polished by the telling. The listener was not a passive recipient. They were an active participant, internalizing the rhythm, the cadence, and the essential truths of the narrative. This oral tradition created a shared consciousness among those living within the castle. They came to possess a common vocabulary of archetypes and values that informed their daily decisions. A shortage of grain, a structural failure in a wall, or the onset of a particularly bitter storm, the collective mind could draw upon these stories for guidance, resilience, and perspective. This practice also fostered an immense respect for the elders and the experienced. The person who could hold the attention of the hall, who could weave a narrative that offered both escape and instruction, was a pillar of the household's stability. In our modern world, we often collate information with wisdom, but in the medieval castle, wisdom was recognized as the ability to synthesize experience into story that gave meaning to the present. As you sat in the circle around the hearth, listening to the same legends that had been told for centuries, you weren't just hearing a tale. You were being initiated into a lineage. You were learning that your own life, with all its daily struggles and quiet victories, was part of a much larger, enduring story that would continue long after the embers died down. While history often focuses on the spectacle of the castle, the banners on the battlements, the grand feasts, or the architectural prowess of the stone masonry, the true essence of life within these walls was defined by the relentless, invisible labour of stewardship. This was the quiet, uncelebrated work that prevented the collapse of the social and physical structure. It was the perpetual movement of servants and stewards who understood that if they faltered, the entire ecosystem of the castle would descend into chaos. This labour was not performed for recognition. It was an act of profound devotion to the concept of the household. Consider the meticulous management of the castle's resources, a task that required a foresight bordering on the prophetic. Was the daily monitoring of the grain stores for any sign of moisture or rot, the constant replenishment of firewood piles in the dry chambers, and the agonizingly slow process of ensuring that water remained fresh and accessible even when the outer wells were frozen solid. These individuals moved through the corridors with a silent, purposeful efficiency, their presence almost ghost-like. They were the ones who knew every squeak of a floorboard, every drafty seam in the masonry, and every subtle shift in the household's temper. They acted as the nervous system of the castle, detecting and resolving problems before they ever reached the awareness of those they served. This stewardship was a philosophy of perpetual maintenance. There was an understanding that the castle was not a static object, but a fragile living entity that needed constant tending. The dampness of the stone was a constant enemy, inviting decay and illness, and it was only the tireless efforts of those, scrubbing the floors, airing the linens, and ensuring the hearths were properly stoked, that kept the environment habitable. They were the masters of the small fix, a bit of mortar applied to a crumbling joint, a patch sewn into a hanging tapestry, a latch tightened on a heavy door. This was not drudgery, it was an act of high care. They saw their labour as the protective skin that allowed the life within the walls to flourish. Ultimately, this hidden burden of stewardship defined the character of the castle inhabitants. It fostered a culture where utility and duty were the highest virtues. Those who bore this weight did so with a quiet dignity, knowing that their contributions were the literal foundation upon which the comfort of others rested. In a modern world that often equates value with public visibility, this medieval model offers a different, deeper perspective. It suggests that the most essential work is often that which is never seen, and that the greatest strength of any community is found in the willingness of its members to silently hold the structures together. As the day ended and the household retired, it was this layer of invisible, steadfast labour that allowed the castle to remain a sanctuary against the dark, cold world outside, standing as a testament to the fact that peace is always the result of patient, persistent care. In the sprawling open, plan reality of a medieval castle, the modern concept of personal space was a physical impossibility. Life was lived in layers of proximity, servants, masters, and kin occupied the same halls, shared the same warmth of the hearth, and slept within earshot of one another. To live here was to be perpetually aware of the presence of others. Yet, to conclude that this lack of physical solitude resulted in a lack of psychological privacy would be a misunderstanding of the medieval mind. The inhabitants of the castle were masters of a different kind of architecture, the architecture of intimacy, built not with stone walls but with the subtle boundaries of the psyche. This form of intimacy was a learned skill, a delicate social dance performed daily. In the great hall, amidst the noise of the household and the clatter of work, one could find solitude by engaging in a focused task, mending a tunic, sharpening a tool, or watching the fire, that signalled a temporary retreat from social demand. It was a silent, universal understood pact. If a person was deeply engaged in their labour, they were effectively elsewhere. This was not an act of rudeness, but a necessary survival strategy that allowed the collective to breathe. It was an unspoken recognition that even in a group of 50, each individual need a private cathedral in their mind where they could be entirely alone with their thoughts. Beyond the shared activities, the architecture of the castle itself facilitated these moments of retreat. The depth of a window embrasure, the shadows of a vaulted arch, or the high-back structure of a wooden chair could serve as a psychological container. By turning one's body slightly away, by softening one's gaze, or by sinking in the dimness of a corner, an individual could signal their need for respite. It was an elegant system of non-verbal navigation, You learned to sense the social temperature of the room. You learned when to engage and when to offer the quiet, respectful gift of distance. This taught the inhabitant a profound level of self-control and awareness. In a world where you were always visible, you developed a stronger internal life. Your thoughts were your only truly private possession, and as a result, they were cherished and protected. This constant proximity to others did not diminish the self, rather, it refined it. It required you to be constantly conscious of your impact on those around you, fostering a high degree of empathy and coordination. Ultimately, the architecture of intimacy meant that while the castle was a shared home, the human spirit remained vast and uncontainable. You were never truly crowded because you carried the vastness of your own inner world with you, a quiet, inviolable space that no stone wall or communal obligation could ever touch. In the medieval worldview, the castle was rarely viewed as a static asset to be consumed, but rather as an inheritance to be safeguarded. This sense of stewardship was governed by an unspoken ethical framework, the understanding that you were merely a temporary tenant of a structure that had stood long before you arrived and would remain long after you departed. This realization fundamentally changed the nature of labour. The act of patching a roof, reinforcing a gate, or meticulously cleaning a grain store was not merely about personal comfort, it was a moral obligation to the continuity of the community. This ethics of stewardship fostered a profound sense of gratitude. Every item in the household, the heavy iron cooking pot, the seasoned timber of the floorboards, the carefully preserved seed stock, carried the weight of its own history. You recognized that these things had served others before you, enduring the same winters and supporting the same daily rituals. To treat them with carelessness was to break a chain of respect that stretched back through generations. This created a culture where efficiency was not measured by how quickly something could be replaced, but by how long it could be maintained, repaired, and kept in service. This approach also instilled a deep forward-look responsibility. When you tended to the soil of the castle garden or cleared the drainage channels, you were doing so for the people who would inhabit these rooms a decade or a century from now. You were planting seeds for a harvest you might not oversee and build foundation for walls you would never see completed. This was the spirit of the planter, a quiet, selfless commitment to an ideal that transcended one's own lifespan. It required an ability to value the long-term health of the castle over the immediate gratification of one's own needs. Ultimately, this ethic stance was the antidote to the anxiety of a harsh, uncertain world. By tethering your daily efforts to the preservation of something larger than yourself, you moved away from a life defined by ego and toward a life defined by purpose. You were not just a worker, you were guardian of the household's legacy. This gave every mundane, repetitive task a sense of sanctity. Polishing a hinge or sweeping a threshold became a way of saying, "I am here, and I am leaving this place a little stronger than I found it." In this way, the ethics of stewardship transformed the burden of survival into an act of enduring, quiet grace, ensuring that the castle remained not just a structure of stone, but a vessel of human continuity. In the silence of a stone-walled castle, labour was rarely a quiet, solitary affair. While the physical work, the pounding of grain, the rhythmic scrubbing of wooden surfaces, or the steady turning of a hand, mill was demanding. It was almost always accompanied by a cadence of sound. This was the music of labour, a series of chants, folk songs, and rhythmic patterns that served as the height of the household. These were not performances intended for an audience. They were function tools designed to synchronize their movements of those working together, and to transform the monotony of endurance into collective, rhythmic flow. When multiple hands were needed to carry a heavy load or to process materials, the work naturally fell into a tempo. A leader would begin a low, steady chant, and soon the others would fall in step. This synchronization was essential for efficiency, but its psychological benefit was far greater. It created a shared space where the individual fatigue of one person was absorbed by the rhythm of the group. When you were part of this musical motion, you were no longer feeling the ache in your own muscles or the coldness of the room. You were participating in a larger, unified movement. The sound acted as a buffer against the physical burden, turning the grueling repetition of daily tasks into hypnotic, meditative exercise. These songs also act as a repository for the household's emotional history. Often the lyrics were simple, repetitive, and deeply rooted in the land and the seasons, tales of the harvest, of the coming spring, or of the endurance of their ancestors. By singing these words while performing the work of survival, the inhabitants were weaving their current lives in the long lineage of the castle. Every strike of a tool or sweep of a broom became a beat in a song that had been sung for centuries. It was a way of affirming that their lives, however modest, were essential notes in a much larger composition. This integration of sound and labour also served to soften the sharp, often unyielding edges of their environment. The castle, with its cold stone surface and hard angles, could feel indifferent to human struggle. But when the halls were filled with the murmur of work, songs, the space felt transformed. It was an act of domestic defiance. By imposing their own rhythm and their own stories onto the environment, they were reclaiming the space as their own. In this way, the music of labour was more than just a byproduct of work. It was a testament to the human spirit's ability to create beauty out of necessity. It reminded them that they were not just cogs in a machine of survival, but a cohesive living community whose work was, in its own humble way, a form of art. Within the thick, sound-muffling walls of the castle, the spoken word was often used sparingly, treated as a resource almost as precious as fuel or grain. In a space shared by many, where voices could easily become a source of friction or stress, a sophisticated system of non-verbal communication emerged. The inhabitant developed a language of gestures, a silent lexicon of nods, glares, subtle shifts in posture, and meaningful glances that carried as much, if not more, weight than any formal speech. This was not a lack of connection, but a heightened form of it. It was an intimate, highly tuned sensitivity to the moods and intentions of those around you. Consider the simple act of passing a tool or sharing a space at the table. A brief, steady eye contact accompanied by a slight tilt of the head could communicate respect, acknowledgement, or a silent request for assistance. A hand placed firmly but gently on a shoulder was an anchor, a way of grounding a companion who might be feeling the weight of the long winter or the fatigue of a taxing day. These gestures were the lubrication of the household's social machinery. By relying on this non-verbal cues, the inhabitants could coordinate complex tasks like moving heavy furniture or preparing a grand meal with an almost uncanny, synchronized efficiency, requiring only the occasional murmur to guide the flow. This reliance on the non-verbal fostered a deep, intuitive empathy. Because you were constantly reading the physical cues of others, you became hyper-aware of the subtle changes in their well-being. You could sense simply by the way a person walked or the tension held in their shoulders if they were burdened, anxious, or weary. This created a culture of silent care, where needs were often met before they were even articulated. You didn't need to ask for a warm cloak if you were shivering. Someone, having noted the faint vibration of your frame, would simply place it nearby. This fostered a profound sense of being seen and understood, even in the absence of explicit verbal affirmation. Moreover, this quietude was essential for maintaining the sanctuary-like atmosphere of the home. In the evenings, when the fire was the only source of light and the outside world was a void of darkness and cold, the silence was the home's protective shell. It was a space that invited reflection rather than confrontation. By choosing to communicate through gesture rather than noise, the inhabitants were actively curating the quality of their shared environment. They understood that the energy of the home was something to be protected. This refined awareness, the communal life of the castle, not just endurable, but deeply comforting. In the stillness, every gesture became meaningful, turning simple interactions into dialogue of profound, wordless connection that affirmed the presence and importance of every soul within the stone walls. In the rhythm of the medieval castle, scarcity was not an occasional crisis, it was the baseline reality. Food, fuel, and supplies were governed by the cycle of the seasons, meaning that for months on end, the household existed in a state of carefully managed limits. Yet, rather than breeding a culture of perpetual dissatisfaction, this environment fostered a profound philosophy of enough. This was not a passive resignation to poverty, but an active, disciplined appreciation for the sufficiency of one's current state. It was the recognition that true peace of mind is found not in the accumulation of excess, but in the mastery of one's own requirements. The philosophy of enough began with a deep respect for the intrinsic value of every resource. When you possess only as much grain as the storehouse can hold for the winter, every handful carries weight. You do not treat it with indifference. You treat it as a vital component of your survival. This creates an immediate, visceral connection between the object and the person. You stop looking at the world as a collection of commodities to be consumed and start seeing it as a finite, precious assembly of assets that must be balanced. In this state, enough is not a restriction, it is a measurement of harmony. It is the point where your needs are met and your future is secure, a state of equilibrium that brings a deep, quiet satisfaction. This mindset acted as a powerful shield against the anxieties that plague the modern spirit. Because the inhabitants were not perpetually chasing the more that defines contemporary life, they were spared the restless, gnawing hunger for constant improvement or change. Their focus was internal and present. They found contentment in the warmth of a fire that was just hot enough, in a loaf of bread that was just full enough, and in a blanket that was just thick enough to keep the cold at bay. By setting these boundaries, they protected their capacity for happiness from being anchored to unstable, external variables. They learned that joy was not a luxury to be bought or acquired, but a byproduct of living in accordance with the limits of their world. Ultimately, this philosophy of enough granted them an unexpected form of freedom, the freedom of detachment. When you define your success not by the volume of what you possess, but by the integrity of how you live, you become less vulnerable to the caprices of fate. If the harvest was lean, the household adjusted. If the winter was harsh, they endured. They did not equate their worth with their wealth. This internal stability allowed them to face the uncertainties of the outside world with a steady, resolute heart. By embracing the sufficiency of the moment, they transformed their scarcity into a source of strength, proving that the most profound sense of abundance is not found in having everything, but in truly needing nothing more than what you have in hand. It was the ultimate domestic wisdom, the art of finding a complete and enduring sense of home within the simple, sturdy borders of enough. Within the thick, windowless confines of a medieval castle, the eyes were often the least reliable guides. In the long hours of the evening or the dimness of a storm-lashed day, the inhabitants navigated their world through a sophisticated sensory map, a geography of sound and smell that was far more intimate than any visual layout. To live in the castle was to know every vibration of the stone, and every shift in the air, creating a mental architecture that functioned regardless of the light. Sound was the primary navigator. The castle was not silent. It hummed with the constant, rhythmic language of the structure itself. You learned to read the building, the deep, resonant thrum of the wind against the outer curtain wool, the sharp, metallic click of a latch in a distant corridor, or the steady, low frequency groan of timber beams settling under the weight of the roof. Even the floor beneath your feet had a voice. The slight hollow vibration of stone flags in the buttery meant the kitchen staff was busy, while the heavy, dull thud of footsteps in the barracks indicated the changing of the guard. By listening, you knew exactly who was moving, where they were headed, and what the social climate of the castle was at any given moment. It was a form of auditory spatial awareness that modern life, with its constant white noise, has almost entirely erased. Smell, in turn, provided the emotional anchoring of the space. The castle was a layered olfactory environment, the sharp, crisp scent of wet limestone in the subterranean vaults, the warm, comforting drift of wood smoke from the great hall, and the subtle, earthy perfume of dried rushes and herbs strewn across the floors. These scents were not merely background features, they were territorial markers. The moment you stepped through a doorway, the shift in aroma told you exactly where you were. The scent of tallow and beeswax signalled the transition to private chambers, while the faint, bracing scent of lye and damp earth marked the transition to the working areas. This sensory map was deeply ingrained, providing a sense of home that felt physical and constant. This sensory mapping fostered an extraordinary level of presence. Because the inhabitants were so finely tuned to their environment, they were rarely startled or lost. Their bodies moved with a fluid, unconscious grace, knowing instinctively how to navigate a dark stairwell by the change in airflow or the cooling of the stone under their fingertips. This was not a passive existence, was an active, constant dialogue with the materials of their world. It reminded them that the castle was not a static object they occupied, but a living, breathing entity they were a part of. In the darkness, when the visual world faded away, this sensory map remained, holding them in a cocoon of familiarity and order, a silent reminder that they were precisely where they belonged. The process of dressing and undressing with a medieval castle was far more than a morning or evening necessity. It was a rhythmic, meditative ritual that framed the inhabitants' transition between the roles they played and the individuals they were. Clothing was not merely a covering. It was a layered construction of linen, wool and leather, designed to withstand the biting chill of stone corridors and the demands of labour. To dress was to assemble one's social armour, and to undress was an act of profound decompression, a shedding of the day's burdens that allowed the spirit to return to its essential, unadorned state. Consider the complexity of this daily ritual. Layers of tunics, surcoats, and cloaks were carefully arranged, secured by pins, belts, and laces. Each layer had a purpose. The linen closest to the skin provided cleanliness and comfort, while the heavy outer layers of wool offered insulation against the castle's perpetual dampness. This layering process was a physical manifestation of duty. As one tightened a belt or fastened a clasp, They were mentally preparing for the tasks ahead, the administrative responsibilities, the manual chores, or the social expectations of the great hall. It was an act of deliberate focus, a time when the mind could settle and define its purpose for the coming hours. Conversely, the evening act of undressing was a sacred return to the self. As the layers were peeled away, the heavy cloak, the structured tunic, the restrictive belt, there was a physical release of tension. The skin, having been contained all day, could finally breathe, the body, having held itself in a specific posture for the sake of utility or status, could finally slump into its natural, relaxed shape. Was the moment of transition from the public to the private. By removing the clothing that defined one's role in the castle's hierarchy, the inhabitant effectively set aside their responsibilities. It was a shedding of the day's worries, a way to signal to the mind that the time for performance was over and the time for restoration had begun. This ritual highlighted the intimate connection between the human form and the environment. Because the castle's temperature fluctuated wildly, the act of dressing was also a constant adjustment to the elements. You learned to read the weather by the feel of the stone walls, be deciding which garments to pull on. This constant interplay between the body and the layers of fabric created a heightened awareness of one's own physical reality. Dressing was not a vanity, but a dialogue with the environment, an acknowledgement of the cold, the draught, and the necessity of protection. In this way, the simple act of preparing for the day became a form of mindfulness, a grounded physical practice that kept the inhabitant firmly anchored to the reality of their existence, preparing them to face the challenges of the stone sanctuary with quiet, resilient intent. In the medieval castle, where survival depended entirely on the foresight of the harvest, the storage areas were the true heart of the structure's longevity. The great hall might have been the centre of social life, but the buttery, the larder, and the cellar were the centres of gravity. The organisation of these spaces was not merely functional, it was an exercise in geometry and physics, a meticulous system designed to combat the inevitable enemies of moisture, pests, and rot. Every object, from the heavy wheels of salted cheese to the bundles of dried medicinal herbs, occupied a deliberate, precise coordinate within the castle's architecture. Storage was governed by the laws of vertical and horizontal placement. Heavy, low-density goods, like salted meats and grains, were kept in the lowest, driest levels, where the stone walls provided a consistent cool temperature, a natural preserving technology. Higher up, where the air was warmer and potentially more humid, were items that required frequent access or needed to be kept away from the damp ground, rolls of linen, candles, and precious spices. This vertical hierarchy was a living map of the castle's resources. A skilled steward could navigate these storage chambers in near, total darkness, knowing exactly how many paces to take and where to reach, relying on a mental grid that maximised space and minimised the risk of spoilage. This was an art of spatial intelligence. To store was to anticipate the future. When items were arranged, they were not just pushed into corners, they were organised to ensure air circulation, a vital necessity in a building made of stone and mortar. Wooden crates were lifted on frames to prevent contact with the damp floor. Grains were stirred regularly to prevent compacting. This constant maintenance of the geometry of storage was a physical discipline. It required a deep understanding of how material objects interact with the environment, how wood breathes, how salt attracts moisture, and how heat rises. It was a silent, scientific observation of the world, performed daily by those who understood that their comfort was directly proportional to the order of their surroundings. Ultimately, this organization was a form of psychological security in an era where the outside world was unpredictable, where a harsh winter or a late spring could threaten the very fabric of life. The sight of a well-ordered storehouse provided a profound sense of calm. It was a tangible proof of mastery over one's circumstances. When you walked into the cellar and saw the neat, deliberate arrangement of supplies, you were not just looking at food and tools, you were looking at the stored-up time and effort of the community. It was a testament to the belief that with patience, discipline, and a respect for the properties of the physical world, one could create a sanctuary of stability. The chaos of survival was brought into alignment, organized into a grid of hope, ensuring that no matter how long the winter, the household would endure. To lead within the confines of a medieval castle was not a role of privilege, but one of profound, heavy-duty service. The steward or the lord, responsible for the delicate equilibrium of the household, lived in a state of perpetual anticipation, while the rest of the inhabitants could find comfort in the rhythm of their daily tasks. The leader was tasked with the weight of the collective future. This position brought with it a specific, quiet solitude, the burden of knowing exactly how thin the margins of survival truly were. It was a loneliness born not of isolation, but of the responsibility to be the one who looked ahead while others focused on the present. This solitude was woven into the very structure of their day life. While they moved through the same halls as everyone else, their internal experience was occupied by the what-ifs, the inventory counts, the structural integrity of the masonry, the seasonal shifts in trade, and the health of community. Every decision was a calculation of resource. If a winter lasted 2 weeks longer than projected, the steward was the one who had to manage the hunger and the morale. They had to act as the reservoir of confidence, projecting a steadiness they did not always feel, maintain the facade of security so that the household could focus on their work. This was the solitude of the lighthouse keeper, an awareness that your stability was the prerequisite for everyone else's peace. The paradox of this authority was that the more capable the leader, the less visible their work. When the castle functioned perfectly, when there was enough grain, when the fires remained lit, and when the internal harmony was maintained, their labour seemed invisible, or perhaps even unnecessary. Their success was experienced by others as an absence of crisis. This meant that the emotional rewards of leadership were rarely found in public acclaim, but in the private, quiet observation of a household running smoothly. There was a stoic grace in this, accepting that your most important work would go unremarked upon, simply because it was the foundation that allowed life to flourish elsewhere. Ultimately, this burden of authority shaped a unique temperament, one of high discipline, intense empathy, and a deep, grounded humility. They learned to listen to the whispers of the castle long before they became cries for help. They understood that the true strength of their leadership lay not in command, but in coordination, the ability to weave the individual efforts of the household into cohesive, enduring whole. Even in the stillness of the night, while the rest of the castle slept in the safety they had carefully curated, the leader remained in the shadow of their own solitude, quietly weighing the future. It was a life of service that demanded everything, their focus, their foresight, and their peace of mind, all to ensure that the sanctuary remained a sanctuary, and that the long cold darkness outside never breached the stone walls. After the relentless discipline of stewardship, the meticulous organization of resources, and the stoic endurance of the long seasons, there arrived the threshold of celebration. In the medieval castle, Festivals were not merely distractions from the monotony of survival. They were essential physiological and social reset points. They functioned as a necessary release, a controlled explosion of collective energy that allowed the inhabitants to break free from the rigidity of their daily roles and reconnect with one another on a visceral, human level. This was the moment when the heavy armour of duty was temporarily set aside, and the stone walls, usually so solemn and protective, echoed with a different kind of life. The transition to a festival was marked by a shift in the castle's sensory landscape. The familiar scents of damp stone and wood smoke were overtaken by the rich, indulgent aromas of roasting meats. Spiced honeyed drinks and freshly baked bread, rare luxuries that signalled the suspension of the philosophy of enough. The soundscape changed entirely, the rhythmic utilitarian work. Songs were replaced by the unpredictable laughter of the crowd, the strumming of instruments, and the chaotic joy of communal dancing. This was a deliberate turning up of the volume of life. It was as if the entire household, having held their breath through the long months of labour, was finally exhaling. These moments of release were vital because they acknowledged the profound humanity of those living within the fortress. Even the most stoic leader and the most exhausted labourer need to feel the expansive, unburdened joy of being alive. During these times, the social hierarchy was often subtly inverted or softened. In the shared warmth of the great hall, under the flicker of extra torches, the boundaries that usually defined one's place in the structure, the silent gestures the distance kept, the focus on duty, were momentarily dissolved. A story told by a servant could hold the same weight as a decree from the Lord, and the laughter shared across a table carried the same legitimacy as a formal agreement. Yet there was an inherent wisdom in how these celebrations were structured. They were finite. They were bounded by the turning of the sun and the calendar, acting as a brief, intense bridge between one period of labour and the next. This ensured that the festival did not lead to decay, but rather to renewal. After the final torch flickered out and the echoes died down, there was a quiet, almost meditative return to the rhythm of the castle. The inhabitants did not feel regret for the end of the feast. Instead, they returned to their chores with a renewed sense of purpose. The release of energy had cleared the internal clutter, leaving them refreshed, rebonded, and ready to face the long stone, walled work of the future with a deeper sense of perspective. Ultimately, these festivals proved that even in a life defined by the rigid constraints of survival, there was always room for the spirit to soar. It was the final, elegant piece of the castle's architecture, the understanding that to maintain a sanctuary, for the long term, one must occasionally throw the doors wide open. By embracing the chaos of joy, the inhabitants confirmed that they were not merely prisoners of their environment, but its masters capable of both the iron-willed endurance of winter and the light-hearted celebration of spring, holding the two in a perfect human balance. For centuries, the human spirit was shaped by the literal, unyielding boundaries of stone and mortar. We have explored how those physical constraints, the thickness of walls, the cold of the embrasure, the narrowness of the stairwell, forced an internal discipline. But as we step away from the physical fortress, we are left with a critical question. What happens to this architecture when the stone is removed? The challenge for the modern individual is no longer to survive within a protected space, but to become the architect of their own internal fortress. To build an architecture of the self is gangs that stability is no longer something imposed by a master or a castle wall. It must be constructed from within. In the medieval mind, the castle provided a template for existence, clear roles, seasonal rhythms, and physical limits. Without those boundaries, we are faced with the dizzying expansion of choice. We must learn to define our own load-bearing values, those non-negotiable principles that hold our lives upright when the world outside feels volatile. If the castle was built to keep the cold out, the modern self is built to keep the inner light from being extinguished by the frantic pace of the external world. This transition requires a shift in how we perceive our own boundaries. Where the castle inhabitant was protected by a portcullis, we must protect our focus and our peace with the boundaries we draw in our time, our energy, and our commitment. We are no longer defined by the walls that contain us, but by the space we carve out for our own growth. This is an architecture of intent. It means knowing which influence to keep at the gate of our consciousness and which to let pass. Recognizing that our mental resources are just as finite and precious as the grain stored in a winter larder. Ultimately, this is the most difficult form of building. It requires the same rigorous honesty as the master builder who knows that a flaw in the foundation will eventually bring down the tower. By internalizing the lessons of the fortress, the need for order, the respect for limits, and the commitment to a shared purpose, we do not lose our freedom. We gain the capacity to thrive in the open. We become our own masters, constructing a sanctuary of character that can move through the world without needing a physical wall to stand tall. We are no longer dwellers in a castle. We are the castle itself, standing firm, purposeful, and clear, eyed in the vast, unfortified landscape of the modern age. The medieval observer lived in intimate dialogue with the decay of their own world. They saw the timber warp, the iron rust, and the stone slow surrender to the relentless erosion of the seasons. To the modern eye, this might appear as a tragic narrative of loss. To the medieval inhabitant, it was a profound lesson in the alchemy of transience. They understood that permanence was not an inherent quality of objects, but a temporary state to be carefully maintained. This perspective is the ultimate antidote to the anxiety of our modern era, which often demands that everything remain pristine, new and unchanging. Finding permanence in an impermanent world is not about stopping the clock. It is about shifting our definition of what lasts. In the castle, when a roof eventually failed or a wall crumbled, the inhabitants did not view the building as dead. They saw it as a cycle. The energy they had invested in that structure, the care, the labour, the shared rituals, remained as part of the castle's history, even if the stones themselves moved. They understood that the thing was not the objective. The continuity of the effort was the true monument. This is the alchemy of transience. Transform our attachment to the object into a respect for the process of living. For us, this means letting go of the desperate need for static success. We are taught to build brands, careers, and lifestyles as if they were meant to be eternal monuments. When they inevitably shift or fade, we experience it as a personal failure. By adopting the medieval mindset, we learn to treat our lives as a series of seasonal structures. We build what we need for the current season with all our heart, but we hold it with an open palm, knowing that when the season shifts, we will be called to repurpose that energy into something new. We stop mourning the ruin of our past efforts and start seeing them as the necessary foundation for the next stage of our architecture. This realization brings a surprising, quiet liberation. It removes the fear of failure, because failure is simply the natural transition point between one structure and the next. If we view our lives as an ongoing, iterative process rather than a static construction, we gain a sense of true endurance. The permanence we seek is not found in the stability of our external circumstances, but in the steadfastness of our internal commitment to live meaningfully, regardless of how often the landscape changes. Like the ancient stonemason who knew that his work would eventually weather, we find that our true legacy is not the building we leave behind, but the quality of the spirit we brought to the building of it. In the quiet life of the castle, the concept of legacy was not abstract. It was held in the oral retelling of history around the hearth. The inhabitants saw them as custodians of a chain that stretched far beyond their own lifespans. They understood that their daily work, the preserving of grain, the maintenance of the structure, the nurturing of community bonds, was a form of communication with the future. They were building a bridge. For the modern individual, the duty of memory is perhaps our most vital responsibility, yet it is the one we are most tempted to abandon in favour of the immediate and the digital. Being a bridge between eras requires an active, intentional curiosity. It is the practice of looking at the challenge of our own time, our fragmentation, our speed, our pursuit of excess, and asking, how did those who lived before us navigate the human condition when faced with similar weights? We often assume that the past is a foreign country with little to teach us, but this is a mistake. The core of human experience, the desire for belonging, the need for purpose, the struggle with scarcity is a constant. By engaging with the wisdom of the medieval domestic life, we are not romanticizing the past. We are mining it for the foundation principles that allow humanity to endure. This duty is not about preservation in a museum sense. It is about translation. It is taking the rhythms of the castle, the appreciation for the slow, the respect for the material, the commitment to the communal, and translating them into a language that functions in the 21st century. It is the act of consciously choosing which parts of our history we carry forward and which we let go. When we recognize that we are a bridge, we stop living as isolated individuals. We realize that we are part of a long-form narrative, and the quality of our current life will set the tone for those who follow. Ultimately, this responsibility shifts our perspective on time. We stop seeing ours as the endpoint of progress and start seeing ours as stewards. We acknowledge that the stone we are laying today, in our habits, our relationships, and our community contributions, will form the foundation for others. It is a powerful, grounding realization. It removes the pressure to be innovative at the cost of being human, and instead challenges us to be deeply, authentically connected. We become the keepers of the flame, ensuring that as we pass through this era, we leave behind a structure of wisdom that is sturdy enough to hold the next generation. In the modern landscape, we are conditioned to view motion as synonymous with progress. To be busy is to be relevant. To be still is to be obsolete. Yet, if we look to wisdom of the castle, we find a starkly different truth. The most critical moments of leadership and survival were those where the pace was intentionally brought to a complete halt. This was not the inaction of the idle, but the active power of rest, a tactical stillness that allowed for the processing of reality before a single action was taken. The steward who stopped to stand in the quiet of the buttery, observing the grain, was not doing nothing. They were engaged in a deep sensory diagnosis of their environment. By choosing to stand still, they gained the ability to see patterns that remained invisible to those constantly in motion. In our own lives, we often so caught up in the doing, the reacting, the managing, the constant stream of digital output, that we lose the ability to see the architectural flaws in our own daily lives. We rush to patch the cracks in our day-to-day existence with ever stopping to ask if the foundation itself is sound. The courage to stand still is the courage to face the uncomfortable. When you stop moving, the noise of the external world falls away, and you are left alone with the internal reality of your thoughts and the current state of your life. For many, this silence is terrifying, so we fill it with distractions. But for those who cultivate the discipline of stillness, it is the most productive state imaginable. It is in these moments of quiet observation that we regain the perspective needed to choose the right path, rather than merely the fastest one. It is a form of mental deep cleaning where we discern between what is essential and what is merely loud. Ultimately, this is a practice of holding the centre. Just as the keep of the castle stood firm while the seasons raged around it, the individual who masters stillness becomes a point of stability for everyone around them. You stop being a reactive element in the chaos of modern life and start becoming a stabilizing force. You learn that by stopping, you do not fall behind. You move to a deeper level of intelligence. This is the ultimate reclamation of agency. To prove that you are not a puppet of your schedule, but a conscious architect who knows precisely when to move and, just as importantly, when to hold the line, stand perfectly still and observe. We began this journey by looking for shelter within the stone walls of a medieval castle, seeking order in an unpredictable world. We learned the discipline of the seasons, the wisdom of scarcity, the weight of authority, and the sanctity of the mundane. But we must acknowledge the fine paradox of our search. A wall that is built to protect can, over time, become a wall that isolates. The ultimate maturity of the human spirit, the true goal of our architectural endeavour, is to arrive at a state where the fortress is no longer a cage. To live with an unfortified heart is not to be vulnerable in the sense of being weak. It is to be so securely anchored in one's own values that we no longer fear the world outside. An unfortified heart is the mark of someone who has done the deep work of internal construction. Having built a strong foundation of principles, a quiet discipline, and a resilient sense of self, you no longer need the heavy gates of suspicion, defensiveness, or cynicism to keep your integrity intact. You can walk through the world with an open gate, because your sanctuary is not defined by where you hide, but by who you are. You recognize that the light of human connection, the vibrancy of new ideas, and the raw beauty of unfiltered experience are the very things that give life its meaning, and you can only truly receive them when you are not constantly standing guard. This does not mean we abandon the boundaries we have worked so hard to establish. It means we have graduated from defensive boundaries to selective ones. We are no longer keeping people or experience out because we fear they will overwhelm us. We are choosing how to participate in the flow of the world with clear-eyed intention. We carry our peace of mind with us like an internal hearth, one that cannot be extinguished by the wind of external change or the harshness of others' actions. We have moved from the shelter of the stone to the freedom of the open road, carrying the lessons of the fortress within our very character. As we conclude this long narrative, reflect on the transition you have made. You have travelled from the cold, damp dark of a medieval winter to the bright, open horizon of your own potential. You have learned that life is an art of both holding on and letting go, of building the structure that keeps you safe, and having the courage to walk out of it when it is time to engage with the world. You are now the gatekeeper, the architect, and the traveller all at once. The castle may have been the starting point, but the capacity to live fully, openly, and resiliently is your true destination. You are ready to step out, to leave the gates wide open, and to live not just as a dweller in a sanctuary, but as a vibrant, steady, and unfortified participant in the vast beauty of the human experience. Sleepy History with Benedict is created for relaxation, entertainment, and sleep purposes. The stories shared on this channel are inspired by historical events, daily life, and real periods in history, but they may be simplified, adapted, or narrated in a calming way to enhance the listening experience. This content is not intended to be a precise academic or educational source. While we aim to stay generally accurate, some details may be altered for storytelling flow and relaxation. Please do not rely on this channel as a primary source for historical research or study. By listening, you acknowledge that this content is designed to help you unwind, relax, and fall asleep. Thank you for your understanding and support.